The morning sun streamed through the massive windows of JFK International Airport's Terminal 4, casting long shadows across the polished floors. Dr. Maya Richardson stood quietly in a corner near her gate, her hand steady as she pulled out a small cloth bundle from her designer briefcase. She had performed this ritual hundreds of times before her flights, a practice that had helped her overcome her fear of flying and led her to become one of the country's most traveled psychiatric researchers. The terminal buzzed with its usual morning energy. Business travelers hurrying past with their coffees, families corralling excited children, and airport staff going about their routines. Dr. Richardson took a deep breath and began her ritual, her fingers working methodically to unwrap the small bundle containing sage and ceremonial items passed down through generations in her family. As she prepared for her cleansing ritual, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about the conference where she was scheduled to deliver the keynote speech. Her research on cultural competency in mental health treatment had changed how institutions approached care, and today's presentation would introduce groundbreaking new findings to her peers. The gentle wisps of smoke from the sage rose slowly in the still air of the terminal. Dr. Richardson closed her eyes, her lips moving in silent prayer. A combination of traditional spirituality and personal meditation had become her pre-flight routine over the years. She wore her usual flight attire, a perfectly tailored navy suit, pearl earrings, and her grandmother's cherished scarf draped elegantly around her shoulders. But the peace of her morning ritual was about to shatter. A nearby passenger noticed the thin trail of smoke and nudged her companion, pointing in Dr. Richardson's direction. Soon, worried whispers spread through the waiting area like ripples in a pond. A business traveler clutched his briefcase tighter, while a mother pulled her children closer, their eyes wide with unnecessary fear. Security. Over here. Someone called out, their voice cutting through the ambient noise of the terminal. Dr. Richardson opened her eyes, still calm but increasingly aware of the growing tension around her. She had experienced moments like these before. Moments when people misunderstood or jumped to conclusions, but something about the energy in the air told her this time was different. She began carefully packing away her spiritual items, maintaining her professional composure even as she noticed more people backing away, some pulling out their phones to record. Her hands moved deliberately, neither hurrying nor dawdling, as she'd learned over years of navigating similar situations with dignity. The click of boots against the tile floor grew louder as security approached. Dr. Richardson stood tall, her ID badge from the prestigious medical center where she worked clearly visible on her lapel. She knew what was coming, had studied and written about moments exactly like this, but knowledge didn't make the reality any easier to bear. Through the growing crowd, she could see airport security officers approaching, their faces set in grim determination. Behind them, local police officers had already entered the terminal, hands resting on their equipment. Dr. Richardson took another deep breath, reminding herself of everything she taught others about staying calm in charged situations. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, about to head to a conference to teach others about cultural awareness and crisis intervention, and she was about to become a case study in exactly why such training was necessary. As the officers drew closer, she straightened her jacket and prepared herself for what was to come, silently drawing strength from the very practices that had just drawn their attention. The first security officer reached Dr. Richardson with his hand raised, palm out. "Ma'am, step away from your bags," he commanded, his voice carrying across the now hushed terminal. Other passengers had formed a wide circle around the scene, many holding phones up to record what was happening. The morning sunlight that had seemed so peaceful moments ago now felt harsh and exposing. Dr. Richardson complied calmly, taking a measured step back. "Officer, I can explain," she began, her voice steady and professional. "I'm a medical professional heading to a conference, and what you witnessed was a personal spiritual practice." She kept her hands visible, remembering everything she taught others about de-escalating tense situations. But more officers were already surrounding her, their stances rigid and expressions unyielding. A female officer stepped forward, her hand resting on her radio. "We've received multiple reports of suspicious activity involving smoke in a restricted area," she stated firmly. The words restricted area echoed in the quiet terminal, drawing concerned murmurs from the growing crowd. "My ID and conference credentials are in my front pocket," Dr. Richardson explained, slowly moving her hand to gesture toward her jacket. "I'd be happy to show you." But before she could finish, two officers stepped forward, one reaching for his handcuffs. The metal clicked coldly around her wrists before she could process what was happening. The indignity of the moment wasn't lost on the crowd. Some passengers shook their heads, while others whispered among themselves. A young woman stepped forward, trying to speak up. "Officers, she wasn't doing anything wrong," but she was quickly waved back by security. As they led Dr. Richardson away from her gate, she could hear snippets of conversation from the onlookers. "Can you believe she would try something like that in an airport?" One person whispered. "But did you see how she was dressed?" "She looks like a professional," another responded. The mix of judgment and confusion in their voices told the story of their assumptions colliding with what they were actually seeing. Dr. Richardson walked steadily between the officers, her heels clicking against the floor in a rhythm that helped her maintain her composure. Her mind raced through her options. She knew her rights, knew the proper procedures, and understood exactly how this situation should be handled. Yet here she was, being marched through the terminal like a common criminal. They passed the coffee shop where she bought her morning tea just an hour ago. The barista who had chatted warmly with her about her upcoming conference now stared in shock, the connection between the pleasant customer and this current scene clearly troubling her. Dr. Richardson gave her a small, reassuring nod as they passed. The officers guided her toward a side corridor, away from the main terminal area. With each step, Dr. Richardson's professional world and personal dignity seemed to blur together. She had spent years building her reputation, earning her position, and helping others understand cultural differences. Now, in a matter of minutes, she was experiencing firsthand what so many of her patients had described to her. As they approached the security office, Dr. Richardson took a deep breath. She knew what would come next: the questioning, the assumptions, the need to prove herself yet again. But beneath her calm exterior, a spark of determination grew stronger. This moment, though difficult, would become more than just an incident. She would make sure of that. The security office felt smaller than it actually was, with its harsh fluorescent lighting and windowless walls. Dr. Richardson sat quietly in an uncomfortable metal chair, her handcuffs finally removed, but her dignity still bruised. A clock on the wall ticked loudly, marking each passing minute that could put her further behind schedule for her conference keynote speech. "Let's go through this again," said the lead officer, his voice carrying a mix of authority and exhaustion. He hadn't bothered to introduce himself, and his badge was turned just enough that she couldn't read it clearly. "You were doing what exactly near gate B23? "As I've explained 3 times now," Dr. Richardson responded, maintaining her professional tone despite her growing frustration. "I was performing a brief spiritual cleansing ritual. It's a practice that helps with my fear of flying. The smoke you received complaints about was from a small amount of sage, which is a common element in many cultural traditions." A younger officer in the corner shifted uncomfortably, glancing between his superior and Dr. Richardson. He seemed to sense something wasn't adding up about this interrogation, but remained silent, furiously taking notes on his pad. "And you thought an airport was the appropriate place for this?" The lead officer's voice dripped with skepticism. He shuffled through her confiscated belongings on the table, her briefcase, the small cloth bundle with her sage, and her phone, which they had yet to let her access. "I've performed this ritual before every flight I've taken in the past 15 years, she explained patiently. "I'm a frequent flyer, and until today, it's never been an issue. If you'd allow me to show you my phone, I can prove who I am and my reason for traveling." Another officer, who had been leaning against the wall, stepped forward. "You claim to be some kind of doctor?" she asked, emphasizing the word claim in a way that made Dr. Richardson's spine stiffen. "Yes, I'm a psychiatric researcher specializing in cultural competency and trauma-informed care. I'm supposed to be delivering the keynote address at the International Conference on Mental Health Innovation in 2 hours." Dr. Richardson gestured toward her phone again. "Everything you need to verify this is right there." The lead officer crossed his arms. "And I suppose you have a fancy office at some big hospital, too." His tone suggested he'd heard every story in the book from people in this room. "I'm the head of cultural competency research at Central Medical Center," Dr. Richardson replied, a slight edge finally creeping into her voice. "My department has actually designed training programs for law enforcement agencies on crisis intervention and cultural awareness." The younger officer's pen stopped moving. He looked up, something clicking in his mind. The name, the credentials, they seemed familiar from a training session he'd attended just last month. "If you just verify my identity," Dr. Richardson continued, her patience fraying, but her dignity intact, "we could avoid wasting any more of each other's time. I understand you're doing your job, but I also have important responsibilities waiting for me." The clock continued its steady ticking as tension filled the small room. The lead officer exchanged glances with his colleagues, their certainty beginning to show cracks. The young officer cleared his throat, finally finding his voice. "Sir," he said hesitantly, I think I might know who she is. That training program last month about mental health response. The one that changed how we handle crisis calls. I'm pretty sure she's the one who developed it." A heavy silence fell over the room. The lead officer's expression shifted almost imperceptibly as he processed this new information. Dr. Richardson sat straighter in her chair, her eyes steady, waiting for the moment of recognition that she knew would come. The moment when assumptions would crash into reality. The young officer's words hung in the air for a moment before he rushed to the small computer in the corner of the security office. His fingers flew across the keyboard while the other officers watched in confused silence. Dr. Richardson remained perfectly still, her expression a mixture of patience and quiet dignity. "Here it is," he said, turning the screen so his superior could see. "Look at this." The monitor displayed a professional headshot of Dr. Richardson speaking at a law enforcement training conference just 3 months ago. Below it was an article praising her groundbreaking work in revolutionizing how police departments handle mental health crises. The lead officer's face flushed as he read the screen. His stern demeanor cracked slightly as he looked back at Dr. Richardson, seeing her properly for the first time. The female officer stepped closer to read the article, her hand covering her mouth in surprise. "You really did design our training program," the young officer said, his voice filled with a mix of awe and embarrassment. "That session changed how I approach my entire job. We've been using your de-escalation techniques on every shift." Dr. Richardson smiled gently. "I'm glad the training has been helpful," she said, her voice warm but tired. "Though I admit, I never expected to be on this side of the situation quite like this." The lead officer cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Dr. Richardson, we need to make some calls." He reached for the phone on the desk, his hands slightly unsteady as he dialed. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. The interrogators had become the uncomfortable ones. Within minutes, the small office became a flurry of activity. A senior airport official rushed in, his tie slightly askew as if he'd run the whole way. Behind him, a police captain appeared, looking both concerned and embarrassed. The original officers stood awkwardly to the side, their earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort. "Dr. Richardson," the airport official began, "I cannot begin to express our apologies for this unfortunate incident. Your reputation precedes you, and this is absolutely not how we treat our distinguished passengers." The police captain stepped forward. "Doctor, I'm mortified. Your work has been instrumental in improving our department's community relations. This is, he paused, searching for words, this is exactly the kind of situation your training was meant to prevent. Dr. Richardson stood slowly, smoothing her jacket. Then perhaps we can turn this into a learning opportunity, she said, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she used in her lectures. Every incident, even uncomfortable ones, can teach us something valuable. The young officer who had recognized her stepped forward. The training video, he said suddenly. The one where you talked about checking our assumptions before escalating situations. We just acted out exactly what not to do, didn't we? The room fell silent as his words sank in. Dr. Richardson picked up her phone from the table, finally able to check the time. I have a keynote speech to deliver in about an hour, she said calmly. But I think I might need to revise it slightly. Today's events have given me some new material to work with. The airport official quickly offered to escort her to a private lounge and arrange priority boarding for her delayed flight. As they prepared to leave the security office, Dr. Richardson turned back to the officers who had brought her in. Their faces showed a mix of shame, understanding, and something else, the beginning of real learning. Sometimes, she said softly, the most powerful lessons are the ones that make us most uncomfortable. Thank you for reminding me why our work in cultural awareness is never truly finished. The private airport lounge felt worlds away from the small security office. Dr. Richardson sat in a comfortable leather chair, a fresh cup of tea steaming in front of her as she reviewed her keynote speech notes. But her mind kept drifting back to the events of the morning, seeing them now through both personal and professional lenses. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. The young officer who had recognized her stood there, looking uncertain. Dr. Richardson, I hope I'm not disturbing you, but there are some people who'd like to speak with you, if you're willing. Behind him stood several airport staff members, including the coffee shop barista who had served her earlier. Each face showed genuine concern and a desire to make things right. The senior airport official who had rescued her from the security office stood with them, along with the police captain and a few other officers. Please come in, Dr. Richardson said, setting aside her notes. She noticed how they entered cautiously, as if the space around her had become sacred ground. The barista stepped forward first, holding a fresh cup of tea made exactly how Dr. Richardson had ordered it earlier. I saw everything, the barista said softly, placing the tea down. I served you this morning, and you were so kind. When they led you away, I should have spoken up. Dr. Richardson smiled warmly. You're speaking up now, she said. That's what matters. The police captain cleared his throat. Doctor, we've been reviewing the security footage. The way we handled the situation. He paused, choosing his words carefully. It was textbook profiling. Everything you warned about in your training materials, we did it all. The irony isn't lost on me, Dr. Richardson replied, her voice carrying no bitterness. But let's talk about what happens next. That's always more productive than dwelling on mistakes. The young officer stepped forward again. Would you be willing to use this incident in your future training sessions? I think hearing about it from both sides, your experience and our perspective, it could really make a difference. The room grew quiet as Dr. Richardson considered his words. She looked around at the faces before her, people who had started their day seeing her as a threat and now stood before her seeking guidance. It was a transformation she had taught out for years, but rarely witnessed so directly. Actually, she said, standing up, I have a better idea. Why don't we start right now? She moved to the small conference table in the corner of the lounge. Everyone, please sit down. Let's talk about what happened this morning, step by step. Not as a complaint, but as a case study in real-time learning. For the next 30 minutes, the room transformed into an impromptu classroom. Dr. Richardson guided them through the morning's events, helping them identify each moment where assumptions had overshadowed observation. The barista shared how customer service staff could be allies in preventing discrimination. The officers opened up about their training and where it had fallen short in practice. "See, this is what real change looks like," Dr. Richardson explained, her passion for teaching shining through. "It's not just about attending a training session or reading a manual. It's about being willing to learn from our uncomfortable moments." The airport official, who had been taking notes, looked up. "We'd like to implement immediate changes to our security protocols," he said. "Would you be willing to consult with us? Help us make sure this never happens to anyone else." Dr. Richardson glanced at her watch. Her flight would be boarding soon. "I think," she said with a smile, "this might be even more important than the keynote speech I'm supposed to give. Sometimes the best teaching moments find us, rather than the other way around." The first video appeared on social media just minutes after Dr. Richardson boarded her flight. Recorded by a passenger waiting at a nearby gate, it showed her being led away in handcuffs. By the time her plane landed 3 hours later, the clip had already gone viral, sparking intense online discussions about profiling at airports. Dr. Richardson turned on her phone to find hundreds of notifications flooding her screen. News outlets were requesting interviews, colleagues were sending messages of support, and her research center's public relations team had already fielded dozens of calls. The quiet dignity she'd maintained throughout the morning was about to be thrust into the national spotlight. "Dr. Richardson," called out a reporter waiting at the airport arrival gate. "Can you comment on this morning's incident?" More journalists appeared, their cameras flashing as she walked through the terminal. But instead of hurrying past, she paused, seeing another opportunity to turn the situation into something meaningful. "What happened this morning," she began, her voice clear and measured, "is exactly why my research on cultural awareness is so crucial. But this isn't just about me. It's about countless others who face similar situations every day without the privilege of having their stories heard." Back at JFK Airport, the morning shift officers who had been involved watched her interview streaming live on the break room television. The young officer who had recognized her sat forward in his chair, listening intently as she described the incident, not with anger, but with hope for positive change. Social media exploded with reactions. People shared their own stories of airport profiling, creating a powerful wave of testimonials. But what caught everyone's attention was how Dr. Richardson handled each interview. She never called for punishment or revenge. Instead, she consistently turned the conversation toward solutions and understanding. "The most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger," she explained during a primetime news segment. "It's education. Those officers didn't need to be punished. They needed to learn. And that's exactly what happened in that security office today." The airport's security footage was released with Dr. Richardson's permission, showing both the confrontation and the eventual resolution. Public reaction shifted from outrage to admiration as people watched her transform a potentially volatile situation into a teaching moment. Her phone buzzed with a message from the police captain. "The department has received hundreds of requests for your training program. Your morning ordeal might end up changing police practices nationwide." In her hotel room that evening, Dr. Richardson watched as news channels dissected the incident from every angle. Some focused on the initial confrontation, others on her remarkable response. But what touched her most were the comments from ordinary people sharing how her story had made them think differently about their own biases. A local community leader appeared on screen, saying, "What Dr. Richardson showed us today wasn't just grace under pressure. She showed us how to turn conflict into conversation. That's the kind of leadership we desperately need." The conference organizers had rescheduled her keynote speech for the following morning, giving her top billing. They knew that her personal experience had just added an unprecedented level of authenticity to her message about cultural awareness and institutional change. As she prepared for bed, Dr. Richardson received one last message, this time from the young officer's supervisor. "Your actions today taught us more than any training manual ever could. Thank you for showing us a better way forward." She smiled, thinking about how different this day had turned out from what she'd planned. Sometimes the most powerful lessons came wrapped in the most challenging packages. Tomorrow, she would share her story with her peers, but tonight, she took a moment to appreciate how a simple morning ritual had sparked a national conversation about change. 3 months after the airport incident, Dr. Richardson stood in the same terminal where it had all begun. This time, she wasn't alone. Beside her stood the airport director, the police captain, and several officers, including the young officer who had recognized her that fateful morning. They were there to launch something special, the nation's first comprehensive cultural awareness program for airport security. When I was detained here, Dr. Richardson began, addressing the crowd of staff members and media. I had two choices. I could have responded with anger, or I could see it as an opportunity for change. Today, I'm grateful we chose change. The training center they were about to open wasn't just another room with a projector and some chairs. It was a state-of-the-art facility where security personnel would learn through real-world scenarios and interactive sessions. The walls displayed quotes about understanding and compassion, and one corner held a special exhibition of items from various cultural and religious practices commonly seen in airports. "Remember that sage bundle that caused all the trouble?" Dr. Richardson asked, holding up a similar bundle. "Now it is part of our training materials. Every officer will learn about different cultural practices they might encounter. Knowledge replaces fear, and understanding builds bridges." The young officer stepped forward to share his perspective. "That day changed how I see my job," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet terminal. "Now, when I notice something unusual, my first response is to ask and learn, not assume and act." The program they created together was revolutionary in its simplicity. Security personnel would spend time learning from community members about their traditions and practices. They would understand why someone might carry prayer beads, wear certain clothing, or yes, perform cleansing rituals before flights. But the most beautiful part, Dr. Richardson explained, is how this program grew beyond our original vision. Other airports had already begun requesting the training materials. Police departments across the country were adapting the program for their own use. What had started as one difficult morning had grown into a movement for change. The coffee shop barista who had witnessed the original incident now helped train other customer service staff on being active allies in preventing discrimination. She had become an unexpected champion for change, showing how everyone in the airport community could make a difference. 6 weeks ago, the police captain shared, we had our first success story. An officer recognized a traditional healing ritual being performed near a gate. Instead of calling for backup, she approached with respect, had a conversation, and learned something new. That's the kind of change we're creating here. Dr. Richardson walked through the new training center, touching the interactive displays and educational materials that had grown from her experience. Her eyes fell on a photo wall showing airport staff learning about different cultural practices, each image a story of understanding replacing fear. "You know what makes me most proud?" she said, turning to the group. "It's not the fancy facility or the national attention. It's the simple fact that somewhere out there, someone is having a better day at the airport because of what we learned from that difficult morning." The young officer who had started this chain of events by recognizing her looked around the room with pride. "We didn't just create a training program," he said. "We created a new way of seeing each other." As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Dr. Richardson pulled out her small sage bundle. The airport director smiled and nodded. They had designated special areas throughout the terminal where travelers could safely perform their spiritual practices. Standing there, watching people from all walks of life pass by, she realized that sometimes the best endings come from the most challenging beginnings. "This isn't really an ending at all," she said softly to herself, watching the group of new security trainees enter the center. "It's just the beginning of a better way forward."